Okay, let's turn that up a little bit. There we go. Okay, good times. I clip this on. Alrighty. One more step here. Where's my YouTube studio? All right. Let's get started here. Cool. I will clear these off. Okay, so today, kind of my hope is to get done with this unit on globalization, so that on Monday we can just talk exam. The exam obviously is on Wednesday, the 5th. In this room, right? So you come here, you bring your device because you'll write it on Canvas. I thought I opened unlimited attempts on the practice midterm. Did I not do that? I meant to. I can check really quickly. But if I can find my mouse, there it is. Okay, let me just double check it quickly. I thought I had opened it up to unlimited attempts, but I could be wrong. Let me just check the settings here. Yes, I have allowed unlimited attempts. So I allow multiple attempts, allowed attempts unlimited. So you should be able to do it as many times as you like. So if you go back in, it should allow you more attempts. If it's not, email me and I'll see if I can figure out what's going on. Okay. So yeah, practice questions are up. I'm going to keep uploading more as I kind of get to it. I'm still building the exam question banks, but it's coming. I'm almost done. About halfway through globalization for the question bank. So yeah, I mean, that is pretty much it. But like, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask for the next practice mission, the plan to upload, when can you likely expect them? Like after the weekend or perhaps during the weekend?
For the globalization questions.
Yeah, or just like the practice missions in general.
Whenever I manage to scramble myself together and get them uploaded is the real answer. Yeah, I just am balancing a lot of things with teaching, sort of getting them in as we can. I'm going to try to get, now that I know that Top Hat doesn't have a test bank that I can use, I am going to try to build them kind of as I go. So hopefully I'm uploading questions kind of relatively regularly and you can just kind of keep running through it. So I will try to keep up with it if my brain allows, and if my time management skills improve slightly. But yeah, I'll try to keep up with it. I'll try to make sure that they're coming out regularly, so that like when midterm 2, as we're doing that stuff, I'll just keep adding questions to it as we go. I'm hoping to get everything settled today for the question banks. So hopefully everything is done before the end of today for this one. Okay. Oh, and yeah, like I was saying, you come in, you write on a device. So I mean, I would recommend a laptop because there is there's 4 short answer questions, like very short answer, and we'll go over that on Monday. They're really straightforward and easy in terms of length, right? So you don't have to worry about writing a ton, but I just feel like typing on an iPad or is going to be a little bit awkward. So I would recommend a laptop, but if you want to use an iPad and you have a keyboard for it or something, that can work as well. And you come in, on Wednesday, I'll give you a password to access the exam, and I'll have some procedures for what you do, because you'll have to check out, once you complete the exam, you'll have to come and check out with me or the not the TA, but the proctor that I'll have helping me. So it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, I hope it'll work. It'll be easy. I've done exams on Canvas before and it works pretty well. So we'll kind of go from there. All right. Any other questions before I jump in? No? Okay. So we were talking last time about globalization, right? And we ended up talking about So we talked about our East Asian tigers of the 1990s, right? Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. And we started in on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China as this kind of next big global grouping. And I think we finished off mostly talking about, actually we didn't finish off because I didn't talk about everything here. Okay, so I think I got to here about leading recipient of direct foreign investment. So I will say, through basically until about 2010, double-digit GDP growth was pretty normal in China. It slowed considerably, although there's good indication that China still gains its numbers. Basically kind of artificially boosts its GDP numbers by misreporting certain GDP figures. But we've slowed down from double-digit GDP growth, and it's somewhere, a little bit more normal, probably somewhere between 4 and 6%. For a long time, I'm going to turn that down. That's a little too loud. All right. For a long time, China was the leading recipient of direct foreign investment, right? So they were getting money from mostly the US and Europe to build factories for companies like Nike, like Apple, and all of this. And they built their economic base and their industrial base largely on that. State ownership, because it is a communist country, or it's led by a communist party, even though it operates on capitalist principles, there's still major state ownership of certain sectors of the economy, especially tech. And even companies that maybe aren't directly owned by the state are going to be connected to the state in major ways. And you can think, was it Huawei? As one of the major ones, right? Leading to a lot of concerns in the West about using devices made by Huawei, and especially Huawei got into some hot water about its 5G technologies that people thought were, potentially being used to spy. So the state still controls big chunks of the Chinese economy, either directly or indirectly. Okay, a couple of other things about China. We see growing inequality, right? What we've seen, in the last 30, 40 years in China is sort of the growth of a super rich class and a lot of people being left behind working very, especially people who've moved in recently from rural areas, moving into the cities and then working at very low wage, very kind of poor working condition jobs. The question has long been for China, what's kind of going to give? Is the free market, can you have a free market, a neoliberal capitalist style free market without free politics, right? Does democracy naturally follow from free markets? And so far, the answer seems to be yes. I mean, if the last week is any indication, China is increasingly, finding parity with the West in major ways, and even ways that I used to think China was considerably behind in tech, chip making, military hardware. They've come along considerably in the last 7 or 8 years, right? Where now they're building pretty advanced stealth fighters. They're able to build their own jet engines that are probably as good as say at least the ones that are built by Russia, if not as good as the ones that the Americans build. And clearly DeepSeek kind of upended the whole, recency bias maybe, but everyone was like, China will never catch up in AI. America has the edge there. Okay, and then China caught up and potentially surpassed the US in AI, so that's super fun. Okay, some kind of headwinds for China though. China increasingly looks like they have a lot of problems in their financial sector, and mostly in the kind of as bad loans. There was sort of a building boom in China. Chinese companies and Chinese banks lent a ton of money to developers to develop these real estate projects in parts of China, many of which have not panned out financially, and there's been significant kind of loans going bad, debt cancellation, developers going bankrupt. So China's already kind of small financial sector sees a lot of headwinds which could slow the economy if banks start to fail. They overinvested in real estate, both in China and abroad. One of the things that happened as the amount of capital that Chinese companies, banks, and individuals had, they were looking for places to park that capital that they thought would at least hold value or increase value. And so they bought real estate all over the place, including places like Toronto and Vancouver. But too much of the kind of Chinese capital base is invested in real estate, potentially making it, vulnerable to a kind of housing bubble crash. But probably the biggest problem that China has is that it looks like China is due for a major population decline. So China's population is just a little over 1 billion today. And by some estimates, that may go down as far as 675 million by 675 million by 2100. So that causes all sorts of problems. Generally, economic growth is predicated on a model of growing populations as well. That's been the classic model for most capitalist countries, right? You have at least a stable or growing population that gets richer and richer and grows the economy. We've yet to see growing economies with declining populations, right? It's something that we can't, especially, a declining population that declines by like a third. So it's unclear. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with that. It means you won't have as many workers to do as many jobs. So if you're going to succeed, you're going to have to, rely on ththings like automation and tech, which China may be able to do. It's unclear, but it is definitely going to cause a huge problem. And, there's going to be a lot of empty apartment buildings somewhere in China. Okay. So, India. So, India, quite a different place than China. Obviously, India now has the world's largest population, right, at, I think, 1.3-ish billion. It surpassed China a year or two ago. It is the world's largest democracy, which, in some ways makes it much more difficult to govern than, say, China. Well, the Chinese, notoriously are able to bulldoze whole villages and residential areas to build infrastructure that they need. This doesn't happen in India as easily because it's a democracy. And in democracies, the public is supposed to have some say at least. So it's become a much harder place to manage than China. And if you know anything about Indian politics, they're extremely messy, right? It's a very chaotic Westminster-style democracy, owing to its kind of roots as a British colonial holding. Okay, India sort of did, I guess, like, from not developed to kind of what it developed economically, it sort of jumped over, building factories in a lot of cases, though they have industrialized. They moved really quickly into high-tech sectors. A lot of, programming, engineering, and services, and less in terms of like doing that intermediate step to building a lot of manufacturing. So you've had, huge inequality in India between, those who could work in tech and those who, say, went to universities, especially universities in the West, and those who haven't been able to do so. So you definitely have, a ton of inequality in India, a lot of agriculture, especially up in the north, and then a lot of, high tech down in the south. So, and if you looked at India in terms of like wealth, most of the wealth is here, and up here is considerably poorer, like in general. Okay, white collar outsourcing has become, kind of the dominant economic sector. And I don't mean to say they have no manufacturing. They just don't have as much, and they haven't gone into things like high-tech manufacturing. Even if we want to talk, say, military hardware, right, which is usually a good sign of how industrialized a country is, India lags badly behind in being able to produce its own military hardware. It's still mostly reliant for high-tech stuff on Russia for high-tech military equipment. They've been talking about developing their own, fifth generation fighter jet for what seems like 20 years. So like a stealth aircraft, but they can't build engines, they can't build stealth materials, and their electronics manufacturing is relatively paltry, even compared to say the Russians, who are no great shakes at it. So India does really well with kind of service industries, white collar service industries, manufacturing. They have some, but what they have is relatively low tech, and they're struggling to make that move into high tech manufacturing the way that, say, China has. Now, in terms of business ties, the fact that English is the lingua franca of India, which is kind of true. So lingua franca is an expression, it means the language of the French, but it's generally been used as the language everyone understands. All these different regions in India often have multiple different languages and dialects. And English, from the colonial period, has become kind of the unifying language in India, which also makes it attractive as a place to outsource for firms in the US and the UK. That's it. Okay, UK, right? Because you don't have to worry about language barriers when you're dealing with India. And I mean, one of the continual problems for India, again, like a lot of developing economies, is this growing gap between rich and poor, right? The very rich in India are doing very well, and they live in places like Goa, Delhi, Mumbai, and then a lot of the rest of the country is cripplingly poor, advancing, but still quite poor. And education remains relatively uneven, right? With a lot of really highly educated people, but then a lot more people with, even lacking a basic education in some cases. Okay, so the R in BRICS, Russia. So Russia has gone through a whole bunch of crazy stuff because Russia is a crazy place. Having lived in Russia for a couple of times in my life, I can tell you Russia is definitely a different place. Hard for Westerners to understand, I'll put it that way. Okay, there's been kind of two major economic phases since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what we could call the wild 90s, where basically a small number of people that today we call oligarchs ended up buying kind of state assets from the Soviet Union at bottom basement prices, getting fabulously and unbelievably rich while everybody else in the country got ginormously screwed over. I have friends who live in St. Petersburg, and they tell stories from the 90s of they had guests coming over, so they went to buy some sour cream, so they could serve them their food with sour cream. And on the way home, they dropped it, and it splattered all over the concrete, and they just fell down and wept because they couldn't afford to go buy another container of sour cream. Right? That's how poor they were in the 90s. So the 90s were wild. Some people got fabulously rich. Most people suffered. And then the Putin era for Russia has been one of generally consistent economic growth with a few kind of moments of recession, but generally a huge rise in everything from living standards, purchasing power, and all of this stuff. So generally the Putin era, and now the Putin era just never ends in Russia. It's been going since 1999. The Putin era has generally been one of positive economic growth, at times wildly positive for the Russians, which is why, if you ever wonder why Russians tend to support Putin, their standards of living have gone up considerably, especially in the big cities in Western Russia. Okay, did I say this? Yes, I talked about this. From the 2000s, right, what happened in Russia. The government basically reclaimed a lot of assets sold in the 90s, especially the oil and gas industry. It had been owned by a company called Yukos, which at the time, in 1999, when Putin took over Russia, Yukos was the second largest oil company in the world, only behind ExxonMobil. And the Russian government literally just took it apart. right? They arrested the owner, who was a corrupt plutocrat named Mikhail Hodorkovsky. They threw him in jail. They seized all his assets. They sold them to their own companies, mostly Gazprom and Rosneft, and basically renationalized pretty much any industry that they felt was of state, was crucial to the state. So oil and gas and military principally. Now they left some oligarchs, in power. There's people like Roman Abramovich, who for a while, I don't think he does anymore, owned the Chelsea football team in London. So they left them in power as long as they kind of shut their mouths and didn't bug Putin and didn't try to stir up opposition parties. Sometimes this system of government is called authoritarian capitalism because Russia has moved to very much a market system. And today there are more small and medium-sized businesses in Russia than at any point in its history. But there's a strong state hand, especially in industries that are considered crucial. And the crucial industries are oil and gas, right, which drive the economy, and media as well. Media is dominated by the state. Anything else? Oh, yeah, the Russians remain really highly educated, right? Russia has an excellent education system and an excellent series of universities and polytechnics that train a very capable class of people like engineers, scientists, and people in manufacturing and all sorts of industries, with a particular focus. Russia's engineering and R&D is very focused on nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Partially because one of the strategies the Russians had was they massively upscaled their nuclear energy so that most of the Russian economy is driven by nuclear power, essentially so they can export all of the oil and gas they produce virtually to places that will pay them for it. So it remains highly educated. And yeah, it remains also one of the most corrupt economies in the G20, a lot of which came out, when they started the war in Ukraine in 2022, it became apparent how much corruption was in even military procurement. Okay, so in a lot of ways today, Russia is kind of a weird economy because they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and seized Crimea, right? They basically took over the Crimean Peninsula in southern Ukraine. And they sort of halfway invaded and took over the eastern industrial region called the Donbass by, quote unquote, supporting separatist rebels and arming them and probably moving in Russian army units in civilian clothes. And this has basically led to a whole bunch of escalating sanctions since 2014 on Russia. And today, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, right? They're more sanctioned than North Korea or Iran. Okay, I'll just keep going with my points. When they started their, special military operation or the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it basically caused the West to cut them off from the global financial system. The United States and the European powers kicked them out of a system called SWIFT, which is how you move money from banks in one part of the world to another. But because, this has done a bunch of things. For one, it stranded $300 billion in Russian assets, especially foreign exchange, that they kept in Western banks so that they could use them to buy things in the West. So there's about 300 billion of that stranded mostly in Europe. But it doesn't seem to have stopped anything because prior to their invasion in 2022, Russia had sort of started building parallel structures. So they had built parallel kind of global money transfer systems that they could use to transfer funds, places like China, Kazakhstan, India, and Turkey. So they've continued to be able to move money and goods around through those places. And it's allowed them to weather the kind of financial storms. Like, I don't know if you remember back to 2022, everyone was like, oh, the Russian economy will collapse in like 3 months. And, I heard that yesterday too. It's been true every single month since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. People are like, the Russian economy is about to collapse. And the same people are still saying the Russian economy is about to collapse. It hasn't collapsed because the Russians took steps to create parallel structures, largely. And essentially, in a 1-year period, Russia went from being a European economy essentially to being an Asian economy. Russia has essentially shifted its entire economy to Asia. And its ties with Europe increasingly are kind of tenuous, right? And with Ukraine cutting off gas transit through Ukraine and the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline at the beginning of the war, Russia's trade with Europe and the United States basically doesn't exist. They're essentially now an Asian economy, and they trade mostly with China, India, and Central Asian countries. Okay, and yeah, well, economists have been predicting that Russia's economy would collapse. They did that in early 2022. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russian economy has actually grown between 2 and 4% a year, and is expected to grow again at about 4% in 2025. And how to put this? Despite the sanctions, Russia's economy has grown so much that it basically became the 4th largest economy. So it went from, I guess, 6th to 4th largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity at about $6.9 trillion. So purchasing power parity is a weird measure of GDP, but it's the best one, which is how much can you actually buy in the country with what you're producing, right? So, well, I mean, I think if you look at it in kind of raw GDP, Russia's economy is about 2.8 trillion, making it slightly smaller than Italy. In terms of what it can actually produce, it's the 4th largest economy in the world, behind China at number 1, the United States at number 2, India at number 3, and then Russia. So it's a kind of a weird place. Okay. I went to study in Russia. I finished my undergraduate degree at St. Petersburg State University, which is St. Petersburg is a very cool place. So I lived there for about a year. And then I've been back a couple of times to do research. So in 2015, I lived there for about 6 months doing research on the TV industry in Russia as part of my dissertation. So I've been, through Russia a few times. It's far less interesting. Okay. Brazil. Brazil, roughly speaking, the 8th largest economy in the world by GDP. Principally still dependent on natural resources, though they're increasing their share of kind of heavy manufacturing. Aircraft has been an area that Brazil's done really well in with their state-owned Embraer, which makes, decent kind of regional jets on the whole. Brazil's biggest problem is their infrastructure is underdeveloped. And the geography of Brazil, right, the Amazon rainforest, which dominates the country, makes it really, really hard to develop infrastructure. There are just places in Brazil you cannot build anything, right? Because you're basically building in forest or you're building in swamp. And the land itself is just really, really difficult to build on. Though it's improving, Brazil, like a lot of Latin American countries, still has a relatively poorly educated population. And it's taken that a long time to kind of get this turned around. But if we look at, what their economy is, it's mostly resource extraction, minerals, and increasingly oil and gas. Okay, so I'm almost done, I think. Just double check to make sure I have enough time. Or if I need to go faster. I got a little bit sideways. Oh, I got 3 slides left. We might even end early today. What a day for a Friday. Okay. I was like, I thought I went on about Russia for too long, but I didn't, apparently. Okay, so following, especially, this 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the BRICS countries, particularly Russia, India, and China, but increasingly others as well, became increasingly concerned that if they crossed the United States and the European Union, that their economies might be extremely vulnerable to being cut off from the global financial system and global trade in major ways. So they have worked pretty pretty consistently since 2022 to build alternative structures through, basically this grouping of countries that they're calling BRICS Plus. And BRICS Plus, okay, I guess Argentina was in, and then Argentina exited when Malay came in. But basically, BRICS Plus has kind of positioned itself as an alternative global system to, things like SWIFT, the banking system, and the World Trade Organization, the WTO, as a kind of different way that countries can get together and work out exchanges. One of the big focuses of BRICS Plus has been trying to figure out a way, essentially, to get off the US dollar, right? The US dollar is increasingly seen by, well, especially Russia and China, as a potential economic weapon that can be wielded by the United States against countries that it doesn't like. So there's been talks about a BRICS currency being developed, right? Like let's say a BRICS dollar or a BRICS currency of some kind that would basically allow the BRICS countries to trade between themselves in some kind of external currency. One of the biggest problems with BRICS in general and a lot of these alternative trade alliances is that, especially Russia. Russia doesn't want to trade in Indian currency, the rupee, because India doesn't have a lot that Russia wants, right? They don't have a lot of resources that Russia would want to buy in rupees, and nobody else cares about rupees. India equally pretty much just has oil and gas they want to buy from the Russians, so they don't really want to trade in rubles, right? Because they don't want to buy a bunch of rubles and have a bunch of rubles that they can only use to buy stuff from Russia. And the same with the Chinese. So they're trying to come up with, ways of trading between each other that would, be a kind of neutral currency that they could all agree on, using for trade between each other and other countries that want to trade with them, like a BRICS dollar or BRICS currency, that wouldn't require you to hold like a whole bunch of Russian rubles or a whole bunch of yuan or rupees. So this has been this is why BRICS Plus has kind of started to work together, trying to figure out how to get around the American-led global financial system. And I think especially for China, there's an assumption that eventually some kind of conflict with the United States is coming, and they don't want their economy to be crashed by the Americans cutting them off from something like SWIFT, right? They want to do what Russia did and come up with alternative structures. Okay, so in 2024, this group, what we call BRICS Plus, expanded. So they've welcomed Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Ethiopia into BRICS Plus. Argentina had joined and then withdrew because Argentina got a new government, and the government of Javier Milei said, we are going to align with the United States, not with BRICS. And they've tried to come up with a whole bunch of new structures. So they developed what's called a new development banks, where all of the BRICS nations, put in some money, but it's mostly from China, to kind of help, get loans for infrastructure projects and other projects separate from, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which are controlled by the US and the European Union. So this has been somewhat helpful, but they've had to do things like, suspend Russian loans to Russia in early 2022 due to sanctions, right? And the way it's working right now is banks that deal with Russian banks, sanctioned Russian banks, can have themselves cut off from SWIFT. So it's causing a lot of complications. Now, the geopolitical stance of BRICS Plus has generally been to maintain a kind of neutral position regarding kind of global affairs, especially the invasion of Ukraine, and refer that to other international bodies like the United Nations. So while Russia is probably the leading member of BRICS Plus, they're the ones that are pushing it the hardest. The alliance itself has sort of said this is not a BRICS Plus issue. This is something that needs to be dealt with by the parties. And yeah, what do they want? I mean, essentially, they want a multipolar world. The big thing that they are sick of is, they want to prioritize economic growth, but multilateralism, right? Away from a world where the United States gets to call all of the shots. The reforms in global governance. They want more members added to the UN Security Council. And they want these organizations, the IMF and the International Monetary Fund, to be reformed so that their presidents aren't always from either the EU or from the United States. They want an alternative financial system that can't be essentially hijacked by the US for geopolitical goals, right? And move away from the US dollar. Okay. So another grouping, and again, you'll see some overlap here between BRICS Plus especially and what's sometimes been referred to as the Next 11. These are so Mexico, Bangladesh, South Korea. Again, South Korea is a part of our East Asian Tigers. Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Nigeria, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Vietnam. They're seen as high potential economies mostly because of population, right? Most of these places have really big populations, right? Mexico has a huge population, as does Bangladesh. We saw about the garment industry. South Korea is already developed and probably in trouble because of population. But Indonesia is probably going to be one of the major economies of the 21st century. It's a huge country in terms of population, as is Turkey. Iran, who knows? They have a lot of oil. And the rest, right? The same thing. Egypt, Nigeria all have big populations, as do the Philippines, Pakistan, and Vietnam. So they have a lot of people. And as manufacturing gets expensive in places like China, increasingly companies are trying to move manufacturing to these places where it's cheaper to do things. But aside from having big populations, they don't have a ton in common. Varied rates of economic growth and relatively variable rates of political stability. Nigeria and Pakistan especially are extremely politically volatile. Pakistan has sort of, ever since independence, has been kind of swinging between a democracy and a military junta running the country, and it'll have a democracy for a while, then the military takes back over. And Nigeria has constant problems with Islamist terrorist groups like Boko Haram, and a strong split between its kind of Islamic north and Christian south. So that country is quite unstable. These other ones, Indonesia, the Philippines, Turkey, Bangladesh, broadly speaking, have seen pretty robust economic growth, but it remains to be seen how sustainable that is, right? Because as you grow, those growth rates tend to slow down, and all of them, essentially are going to experience population declines at some point. So do they get rich before they get old? And that's kind of the race that's on for a lot of these places. I guess especially for like the Philippines and Bangladesh, they also have considerable problems with brain drain and emigration, right? A lot of people who get educated in both places want to leave and go to economies that are more developed and higher status. Okay. So, kind of end off talking about globalization. Even if countries are developing, they do so according to vastly different logics, based on their history, their cultures, and their institutions. So, any sense of that globalization would lead to one system of values, I think at this point has essentially been abandoned. Any hopes that, China would become a democracy when it got developed has basically fallen apart. Same thing for Russia. And increasingly, right, there's little belief that this is going to happen. And so, now it's more about managing different paths through the global economy, but this Western model is no longer seen as absolute, right? every country is going to be different, and increasingly the world is multipolar. As countries that are getting richer don't necessarily want to be under the thumb or under the kind of quasi-control of the US and European Union. So globalization in one way has actually made the world a little bit more unstable. As countries are more able to support themselves, they don't want to be as tied to the US and the EU. Okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm 6 minutes early. Huzzah, the day is won. Okay, so Monday we'll come back. We'll do some exam review. I'll go over some practice questions with you. I can do a Q&A to start. If you have any questions about the material, I can happily do that. And then Wednesday is the exam, but we'll talk about that more on Monday. So we will see you in a couple days. Have a great weekend. Okay.